Welcome to the Develop Yourself podcast, where we teach you everything you need to land your first job as a software developer by learning to develop yourself, your skills, your network, and more. I'm Brian, your host. If anyone can learn to code, like they always tell you online, then why do some software engineers get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars? And why can many not even get hired or are stuck in jobs that are kind of dead-end programming jobs? I want to talk about the three mental shifts that I see that separate code bots from software engineers, what that distinction is, why the code bot career path is dangerous, and some very practical things you can do if you're early on in your career or not so early on to develop this bigger picture thinking that is necessary to thrive as a developer. I should also mention that my advice is my advice. I have very strong opinions that are loosely held, meaning I tell you things as a matter-of-fact way because I think that's easier to digest. It's also based on my experience, being 10 years in the industry, coming in as an outsider, working with hundreds of people at different stages of their career, and owning a coding boot camp. Does that mean everything I say is going to directly apply to you? Probably not. My intention is to give you the kind of advice that I wish I had when I was coming up, and the advice that I feel like is missing online in some of the fluffy advice you read, or some of the just advice you read that's completely off based on people's experience that have basically no experience. So that being said, take what I say and what you read online with a grain of salt, and always question who's giving you this advice, even if it's coming from me. So what is a code bot, and what's the difference between that and a software engineer? When I think about what a good software engineer does, they transform complex logic into code. They take an idea, they understand how to implement it with a programming language or within some sort of system. They understand the trade-offs, the maintenance, the cost of those solutions. Sometimes they explain these solutions to other humans because guess what? As much as we all like AI, we still work exclusively with humans at this point. Unfortunately, if you're in that code bot mind state, you think that learning React or JS or some language is going to make you hireable and make you a developer. Basically, you look like learning this thing, becoming fluent in this particular thing makes me a developer, makes me hireable, makes me able to command a salary. I can take a requirement. Somebody tells me, I want you to write code that does exactly this, and you can translate that directly into code. That is the code bot path, and it's different from the software engineering path. As a software developer, you're paid to understand code. You're paid to solve problems. Code bots get overly attached to a framework, language, a pattern that they learned in university or a boot camp or at their last company. The code bot is a dangerous career path, and it's really easy to stumble onto it. I took this path for a little bit of time. I'm kind of ashamed to say, a little embarrassed. I thought just learning how to code was enough. And I wrote code that worked, but I didn't really know why. My problem solving was really limited to the programming language which I was using, which at the time was JavaScript. I relied on a lot of memorization instead of logic. Remember, this is also before ChatGPT and Copilot, which have honestly made it even more dangerous and easy to fall into a code bot nowadays than it used to be. Right now, if somebody asks you, hey, I want you to make this color of the button green, or I want you to implement this function that does something with a date or something in JavaScript, it's really easy to sit at your computer, type out the name of the function, and Copilot or ChatGPT will just flush it out for you. Or you can say, this code doesn't work, fix it. Here's what it's supposed to do. And ChatGPT will give you the answer essentially. And you can really get by like this for a while, which is scary because eventually this will catch up to you. Guaranteed. This is not a career path you want to go down. Simply being able to type stuff into a keyboard that is code is like making you essentially a glorified typist. It also makes you easily expendable. And first off, I want to say it's okay to start here. It's kind of where we all start. So there's nothing wrong with being a code bot at first because fluency in coding languages is the very first step. It's the prerequisite to actually knowing how to be a software engineer and to craft solutions and use code as a tool rather than your only tool, rather than the main function of what you do in your career. To limit your stay in this little path, this code bot path, there's a few mental shifts you need to make as you're learning. So first shift, you need to poke all the sacred cows. What does that mean? There are some concepts or rules in programming which you hear people talk about, and they'll just take it as like coding law. Like you have to use TypeScript, or only serious developers write unit tests, or JavaScript is stupid. You should only learn Python, or C# is the only thing you should really learn because that's a real programming language. And if you're reading the tech bros on Twitter or LinkedIn, and you're thinking these people are the coding gospel. I've seen CTOs and CEOs say boneheaded stuff. I've said boneheaded stuff that I regret nowadays. Question the value of the advice or any pattern that you're learning. Ask yourself this question. What is the problem that this library, framework, pattern is solving? This will lead you down interesting rabbit holes, and you can use ChatGPT to help you do this. So if somebody says you really need to learn TypeScript, like for example, we introduced TypeScript at Parsity, and it's not just because it's cool. It's because one, it's just needed now on the job. I'm not actually a huge fan of TypeScript, but it does solve a problem. What is the problem? JavaScript doesn't come with types like other programming languages. By the way, neither does Python or Ruby, but people weren't complaining about those nearly as much as they were about JavaScript. Python doesn't use types and Ruby doesn't either. So I always find it a little bit weird that JavaScript got so bullied to use types, and then TypeScript came along, which was made by the same person, by the way, that invented C#. A little JavaScript trivia for you right there. So if you wanted to understand, well, what's the benefit of using TypeScript beyond that I just should? Like, that's not a good enough reason. I've been at companies where people are like, we should use this thing. And then you say, why? And they say, well, everybody's using it. It's the modern, it's the standard. But why? Why? What is the reason behind using it? You have to have a reason. So ask ChatGPT if you really don't know, or do a quick Google search and ask it this. Give me a reason for and against the thing you want to learn. TypeScript, Rust, AWS, pick something. Why should you learn JavaScript? Give me a reason for and against using TypeScript. Then make your own opinion based on what you've learned, and always be prepared to change it. One of the telltale signs of a very junior developer or a person that's just kind of a jerk is that they don't change their opinion on stuff. You tell them why you might not want to use React, and all they know is React. So they get defensive and they say, well, that's the only real choice we have. We can't work with this thing. And I like React as much as the next person, and I've used it throughout my career. But sometimes it actually is easier or more desirable to use something like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And you shouldn't just write that off just because you're used to using React, or because you heard everybody on Twitter is using it and you feel like you're missing out. There's always reasons for and against whatever thing you can imagine. Here's the second shift. You need to know your coding history, which is one of those areas that is really glossed over or non-existent at most coding boot camps, including Parsity. There's only so much you can teach somebody in a 6-month time span, or even in a 4-year time span, or in a 10-year time span. So naturally, you're going to think, do people need to know all this conceptual stuff? Do they need to know about the history of these algorithms that might be interesting, but probably isn't going to help them get their first job? I don't know. Depends on who you ask, right? But I would say this, there's a handful of algorithms and design patterns which dominate the software industry. So the problem that you're trying to solve has likely been solved many times over. In fact, if you're a junior developer, the problem you're trying to solve has been solved at least 100 times over, and you just need to find where the answer is. So you want to get to the root of the problem that you're trying to solve. If you created a really complex if-else statement, or using a conditional statement, and you realize you have like 100 if-else conditions. I did this, by the way, on my first job. I actually wrote a massive, literally 100-line if-else statement, and it worked. And it was in production for a long time for pretty mission-critical application. If you want to know how to make these things simpler, or you're looking at code and you're thinking, this doesn't feel right, this doesn't feel like good code. Again, use ChatGPT for this. There's nothing wrong with copying and pasting an answer from AI or from Stack Overflow, but then go a step further. Say, what is the pattern behind the answer you've given me? When was it introduced? I can guarantee you there's a history behind the pattern or the sample of code that's going to give you that's going to solve your problem. You're going to find that there's very little that's new under the sun when it comes to programming or writing coding. In fact, most of the algorithms that you've heard of, like binary search or quicksort or other sorting and searching algorithms, were made up like in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. There's not a ton that's really new at this point. And then you can begin applying these patterns, which are language agnostic, which mean they aren't particular to a certain language, rather than relying on memorizing certain solutions. Binary search is the same whether you're using JavaScript, Python, Rust, whatever. The concept is the same. The code is simply an implementation detail, meaning however you need to write out the actual logic, the logic is there. It's been determined. It's been solidified. All you need to know how to do now is write it within code, which is actually pretty simple. The logic is really the difficult part, which is kind of what all these shifts are really getting to. Like, learning to code is hard, for sure. I don't want to trivialize that. But you know what's harder? Learning to take something that somebody said in a sales meeting or in a product meeting, and they're saying, we have this idea for some feature on the website we want to make, or some idea for the app, or how to do this faster, or there's a problem. And then you hearing that idea and then coming up with a solution that may or may not involve coding, and then actually going into a text editor and applying that solution and then releasing it out to the public for them to use. That's where the money's at. That's what people want from software engineers. Here's the final shift. Go wide. While everybody is going smaller and trying to get deeper and deeper nuanced in their little code hole, I want you to go wide. Everyone wants to understand the nuances of JavaScript and get another language under their belt. You know how you can tell a really junior developer? I saw this on LinkedIn. This is actually kind of funny. They have like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 languages in their bio. They're like JavaScript, Rust, PHP, Webflow, Figma. They have like a whole toolbox under their bio. And I get it. They're trying to be keyword optimized. So, recruiters see them or something like that. I don't blame anybody. I know this is good intentions behind this, but it's hard to take really seriously, especially if you're like, professional developer. You're thinking, I might know a couple languages really well, maybe 3 at most, maybe 4. I don't know, that I've used professionally. To think that somebody would know, 10 or 12 is pretty wild. But coding is hard. Again, like I say, I don't want to trivialize that at all. People say, oh, coding's easy. Anybody can code. Anybody can code in the same way that anybody can get a 6-pack of abs, right? Is it possible? Absolutely. Is it likely? Absolutely not. But coding is hard, but it can increasingly be handled by AI tools. That shouldn't scare you either. I use AI every day. I love it. It helps me write code. I also know that it's going to be a crutch for a lot of junior developers out there that over rely on it. And then essentially they stretch out their junior period by doing this. They stretch it out because they haven't learned how to do the logic on their own. So if they go to a coding interview, they're going to likely fail because you can't use ChatGPT or Copilot during an interview. When they have to explain their code to somebody else, when it breaks inevitably, they'll also fail and they'll lose confidence in their teammates' eyes and lose a little bit of credibility and respect. I've had all these things happen to me, by the way. So if you're over relying on these tools, they'll help you get through your job and help you be efficient, but not proficient. So make sure you're using them sparingly, and at the very least, ask ChatGPT what the hell this code is doing before you just plop it into your text editor, because that is a very fast way to be a very good typist and a good Googler, but not a fast way to be a very good developer. So to go wider here, to understand the complex web of systems that are working in unison to get code from your laptop to the internet where people can use it and hack it and rip it apart, that is a much less obvious thing to figure out. So deploy your code on multiple platforms. I would use AWS, Vercel, Google Cloud Provider, Netlify, even Heroku, whatever. Figure out how these systems do the exact same thing and try to understand, and in your head, even write it out in a diagram. How does the code get from your machine into a text file? How does that work where now it's on the web and publicly accessible? How does that whole thing work out? If you figure out how that little dance works, you're going to know a hell of a lot more than most boot camp grads and even some CS grads, computer science grads. Go old school. Try to use FTP, or I don't know, maybe don't use that. Maybe just look it up and understand, what is FTP? How did that work? And how does this new flow? How does Git and GitHub and these deployment processes, how are these all related? What is going on here? Discover the relationship between the code on your machine and the code in the cloud or on a server that you do not own. Describe the flow from one environment to another. Use a tool like Excalidraw, which I love to write and whiteboard on. Really cool free site where you can draw out things and sketch out diagrams. Literally look up what happens when a user types a URL in their browser and a web page pops up. So in conclusion, there's a lot more to coding than just coding. We stand on the shoulders of giants in tech, and we leverage the algorithms, the patterns that were made decades ago. And if you learn just a fraction of this stuff, you're going to be confident, capable, and a whole lot more than a code bot, because I want to save you from that path that I nearly went down myself. And nowadays, even with all the information out there, it's even easier to fall in the code bot trap. So don't do that. I always hope that's helpful. And again, please take my advice with a grain of salt and always question who is giving you this advice. What is their motivation behind this? Did they have the credentials and the experience and something to back up their claims? If the answer to those questions is no, then maybe don't follow their advice. Really hope that's helpful, and I will see you around. That'll do it for today's episode of the Develop Yourself podcast. To learn more about becoming a software engineer with us, then check out Varsity.io. If you're not quite ready for that, then jump into our dev30.xyz program, which is 30 days of working on your mindset, habits, and JavaScript skills. Totally worth it. See you next week.